Yeah, it will start. Yeah, it's already 1:02. So, welcome everyone. So, I'm Ash Alam. I'm a senior lecturer in social planning at Melbourne ABP and also a co-director of the Informal Urbanism Hub. And yeah, it's a pleasure for me to moderate this session today. So, before we start, we want to acknowledge that this event is taking place in the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation. We pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in academia. And thanks, we got a relatively modest crowd, both online and here as well. Some of us, thanks all for joining us here to listen to our guest speaker, Kelly Dombroski. So Kelly is joining us from Palmerston North of Aotearoa New Zealand. So Kelly Dombroski is an associate professor in the School of People, Environment and Planning at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In terms of her work, she studies social, environmental, and economic change in the Asia-Pacific region using feminist, post-development, and diverse economies approaches. She holds the prestigious Rutherford Discovery Fellowship titled Transitioning to Caring Economies Through Transformative Community Investment. Kelly is a fellow of the New Zealand Geographical Society and a member of the Community Economies Institute. So Kelly is, I would say, enviably well published. Among her many published books, the Handbook of Diverse Economies, which is co-edited with Gibson Graham, and also a more recent one from this year, which is the Introducing Human Geographies from Routledge. I think these are pretty new. And today, Kelly is going to speak to her more recent book, which is also published this year. So the book is titled Caring for Life, a Post-Development Politics of Infant Hygiene, which was published with the University of Minnesota Press. So without further ado, so Kelly, kia ora, tēnā koe. Yeah, over to you, Kelly.
Kia ora, Ash. And as I'm speaking to you here from Aotearoa, New Zealand, I'm going to start in our customary way, drawing on a te reo Māori greeting and custom. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ngā mihi mai oha kia koutou. A tuatahi ki ngā mana whenua o te rohi I mihi reri atu tēnā koutou. A tuarua ki ngā mana whenua o te rohi nei, ko rangatānei, tēnā koutou. A tuatoru, kia koutou, kua tai mai ki konei kei te tautoko te kaupapa tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa. He nui taku harikoa ki te kite koutou, engari he wiki pauri tēnei, it's a sad week. I mihi atu nei I roto I ngā āhuatanga pauri o te wā, ara I te hinganga o te ariki nui, ko kingi tū heitia po tātou te wherowhero te tuawhitu, he kura I tangahia, he mai aroha, aue taukuri e. So that is an acknowledgement of King Tūheitia po tātou te wherowhero who died this week and whose daughter te puhi ari ki ngā waihono I te pō has just been announced earlier today as succeeding him. So I just acknowledged the land in which you are, the Indigenous peoples of Melbourne, the land where I am in Manawatu, the Rangatane peoples, and also acknowledging all of you who've come online and the people who are there in that meeting room 408. So greetings to you all. Ko waiau, ko remutaka te maunga, I te puaki au, ko ruamahanga te awa, no wairarapa ahau. Ko tērā te rohi o Ngāti Kahununu, ko rangitani hoki, I mihi ana ahau ki a rātou. No ingarani airani, ko tiwanu o kutupuna, he tangata tiriti ahau, toitu te tiriti, he au te tahi o ngā kairanga hau ki Te Kunenga ki Pūrehuroa, ko Kelly Dombroski, tōku ingoa. So just my greetings from the lands in which have nurtured me. So this is Remutaka, where I grew up across, you can see that valley over there in Wairarapa. That's where I consider my home to be, which is in the area of Ngāti Kahungunu and Rangitāne. And my ancestors came from England and Ireland and Scotland. And so I'm here as a person by treaty, and it's my privilege and my responsibility to uphold that. And I'm a researcher at Te Kunenga ki Pūrehuroa Massey University, which is, I'm in the Manawatu campus here. Although my family name Dombroski is from Poland, that's my husband's family name. So there's another whole speech to go with that, which I won't put you through today. So why do I start like this? One is to acknowledge the actual land in which I stand here and to acknowledge the customs of this land, even though I'm zooming over to you guys across the ditch. But also because these things all shape what comes next. It's the standpoint from which I speak and how I think about social and cultural and environmental change. These hills in this image, when I was a child, were covered with gorse. And 150 years before that, it was forest. But now they are regenerated with native bush that will eventually once again become forest. And the land you can see behind them when I was a child was mostly sheep farms. It's now a lot of vineyards. But 150 years before that, it used to flood every season as the mouth of the river was blocked through natural sand drift processes at Wairarapa Moana. And it was the food gathering site of many people in the regions of Ngāti Kahungunu and Rangitāne, Hapu. But once Pākehā settlers got there, they called that lake a flood. It was flooded, and they got their spades out and they used to dig a channel every year to prevent that flood. And Māori protested that because it was actually a site of food gathering. And just up the river here, the Māori Parliament was established at Papawai, and the conflict wasn't really resolved. So they gifted the government this land, hoping that the government would sort out those settler farmers who were not doing things in the right way. But you can imagine how that turned out if we know settler governments around the world. But recently, I had the privilege to be back at Papawai Marae as this moana was returned to the iwi in that area. So these themes of destruction, of the power of the state, of those in colonial majority, but also the long-term quiet and not so quiet resistance of multiple generations of Māori, these ideas have really framed my worldview and the way that I look at the next question that I want to ask you, which takes us well away from Aotearoa and into China and also Australia. And that question is, how does change happen? My book that I'm hoping to talk to you, that I will talk to you about today, got a nice copy here, is about ordinary people attempting large-scale change through small-scale acts. And I'm just going to make you all bigger because I can't see you very well. Feels like I'm just talking to myself, which isn't going to be very helpful. So it's really about those small scale ways that people are attempting large scale change. It's about the everyday actions of ordinary people shaping the city, the town, the peripheries, and the world more broadly. So my background's in environmental studies, development studies and geography. But recently, I was just telling Ash, I've become part of the planning program at Massey. And one of the things that I see our students really struggling with is this inbuilt assumption that it is planning and policy that will shape change. And that's true, but I'm sure you guys in this informal cities group will agree that it's also true that informal processes, ordinary people, resistances, the margins, the unspeakable and the unspoken all shape change as well. So my book's really about thinking about those things, the ordinary practices of people living in urban spaces that both unintentionally and intentionally shape the direction and use of urban form while also responding to it. So I want to share with you this provocation that's shaped my thinking. and shaped the thinking in this book in particular. When I read this quote for the first time, it hit me in the heart. So I'm just going to read it to you now. If our species does not survive the ecological crisis, it will probably be due to our failure to imagine and work out new ways to live with the earth, to rework ourselves at our high energy, high consumption, and hyper-instrumental societies adaptively. We will go onwards in a different mode of humanity or not at all. And that's from Australian feminist eco-philosopher Val Plumwood. Now, there's some definite problems with who the we is in this quote. For those mana whenua I just was talking about, seeking to retain the natural processes of wairarapa moana, don't necessarily need new ways to live with the earth, but need us to pay, all of us to pay attention to the ways that have already worked and restore the relations between people and places that sustain them. But for me, as a settler young woman in my 20s, when I first read this quote, setting out to do PhD research in another country, this really kind of hit me as, yeah, this is what it's all about. I don't know how to live with the earth. And many of the people I spent my time with also didn't know how to do that. So it seemed to me, from that perspective, that we as a species also did not know. So I've shaped a lot of my work since then around trying to answer this question. How do we imagine and work out new ways to live with the earth? But what I've discovered is, which is perhaps really obvious to many people, but as you'll see in this book, is that the new ways to live with the earth are sometimes actually the old ways, right? So I return to this question, how does change happen, but with an openness to what the answer might be. I'm not looking for drivers and leverage points. I'm not looking for a single answer, but multiple answers. I'm looking for the reworking ourselves and our society for those of us that need to, with no expectation that that's going to be simple. And I approached it through thinking about hygiene change. This reworking of ourselves for much of the world includes our hygiene systems. So I've worked on a bunch of other projects that look at change in economies in urban planning around other forms of waste, like organic waste, infrastructure in particular, and green waste. But this project is looking particularly at changes that require something from us that is even more deeply embodied, embedded and habituated, and that's personal hygiene and also infant hygiene. So it gets at the heart of how we sort of think of ourselves as humans and bodies. And probably this has come to top of mind for a lot of us in the past few years with the pandemic, that hygiene practices are not just practices, but assemblages that include a lot of stuff. A lot of disposable stuff and infrastructures of water and logistics and more. So one example of the materiality of hygiene is masks, disposable masks. It's quite apparent. But I've been interested in other forms of disposable hygiene and in particular nappies. So this interest for me actually goes back a really long way. So this is an image from a shop display that was challenging people to think about switching to cloth nappies. But when I was 10, I actually did this awkward speech on disposable nappies at primary school after a teacher told us that just one disposable nappy would take 500 years to break down in landfill. And I was pretty horrified, and it's kind of embarrassing to think back on my speech, but I made a big sign as if I was a protester and kind of marched onto the stage protesting disposable nappies, which was a bit weird, and this would have been like 1990 maybe. So if that passionate 10-year-old comes out, I apologize in advance. But then I went to China and I learned Mandarin in my 20s and I started traveling, and I went to China and I found out that millions of babies don't use nappies at all. So how does it work? They use a mixture of signs and signals, and parents and caregivers read the signs of when a baby needs to go and hold them out over an appropriate spot. And a lot of people say when I mention this, oh, that's what my puppy does. So we already know how to read this in many ways. And what was more exciting to me is that when Procter & Gamble started selling disposable nappies in China, people really weren't that interested to start off with. And those families that did start using them often only used one a day, and that was overnight. So even families using them were using them at a much lower rate than other parts of the world. And this is the complete opposite of how infant formula has taken off in China. So the nerd in me kind of emerged again. Like, how does this work? Like, what does it mean? How do they do it? And can people in other places do it too? Or can you only do it in China where you've got these special split cropped pants and cultural knowledge of how to do it? And, I was really interested in it because of this waste hierarchy, right? And we're told we should stop looking at these things down the bottom of waste. Well, not stop, but it's not as important to look at these things down the bottom of the waste hierarchy, like, how do we compost nappies appropriately? But moving up the waste hierarchy to avoiding and reducing waste completely. So yeah, my nerdy interest came back out again. So back to that question about how change happens. I went to live in Xining, which is, there's an arrow there pointing to it, in the province of Qinghai, and the dotted line, don't know what happened there. The dotted line is the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. So a very high altitude, very dry here. And I did my PhD fieldwork there a long time ago, and I'll talk a bit about that later. But I was interested in how does this practice work and how can it work in other places? But my underlying interest was how do we rework ourselves in our environments? How does this change happen? And I kind of hoped it would be something like this. We would have sort of a linear set of steps and we'd work out, well, first you've got to do this and then you do this and then people will naturally do this and then, nobody will need nappies. But I kind of already knew that's not exactly how change works. It usually looks something more like this. And that linearity is really disrupted. So I use in the book assemblage thinking to think about how to map out hygienes both historically and today. And I started with the Massey assemblage in Xining and Qinghai province, including infant hygiene, but also traditional Chinese medicine understandings of the body, which affected the way that people thought about why this practice was important. I did my fieldwork there for first visit for more than a year with my my eldest child with me, who at that time was 8 months old. And then I returned when she was 3 in 2009 and did interviews and hospital ethnographies to go alongside the ethnographic work I'd done with families. A lot of the people I talked to were Hui Muslim people group in China, but also Tibetans and Han Chinese, particularly migrants from Shandong in the east. So there was a lot of migrants who moved to Xining. And a lot of people working in really, living and working in places without their own private hygiene. So people living in rented rooms, like families living in rented rooms and courtyards with shared bathrooms with other families, people living in their shops who went to public bathrooms, as well as people who lived in apartments or in like low-rise housing as well. And then just because I thought I don't really have enough to do, I'll add in another case study with the Oz Nappy Free Forum, which is a group of Australian and increasingly at the time New Zealand parents, mainly mothers, who were using a Yahoo Groups forum to kind of discuss, like, how do we do this practice of nappy-free hygiene in this cultural environment of Australia and New Zealand. And, that wasn't as messy research because I studied online and I downloaded a full set of posts from the whole of 2009 and analysed them. And I did focus groups in Brisbane, in Melbourne, and in Sydney to talk to parents who were practicing this. And I also participated in the group as a member. So it's an ethnographic approach. So what did I find? I found a lot of things, but I'm just going to start with saying a little bit about Qinghai and hygiene on the plateau. So this is an image of the Qinghai Plateau. You can see it's really dry. The air is dry when you breathe it in. There's a lot of dust. It's a really different environment from where I grew up in that Remutaka photo. And when I first got here, I met a Scottish paediatrician who was working with nomadic Tibetan communities out on the plateau who moved around. And she was helping train just ordinary people to support other people, other women in giving birth. So they didn't have a tradition of traditional midwives, but a lot of people couldn't make it to hospitals because they were nomadic. So she was training people around giving birth. And one of the things they were training around was avoiding childbirth fever and the importance of hand washing. And when she asked them about hand washing, a lot of women in the room, she said, held up their hands and they were kind of damaged. And she said, oh, what's happened there? And it turned out they had been washing their hands, but at minus 30 degrees centigrade in the middle of winter, washing your hands is not a healthy practice. It causes frost damage or cold damage, and in some cases frostbite if it's not dried off again quick enough. So she really said to me, look, hygiene is situated in place, right? What is healthy in urban Australia is not healthy in this environment. And when I asked my colleagues who travel to Antarctica every year, they were like, no way, you never wash your hands. That's a terrible idea. So, we can understand this, but still these, development agencies were going in and teaching the ignorant Tibetan women how to wash your hands, right? And causing these other forms of damage. So that really stuck in my mind. Hygiene is situated in place. And here's some other places in Qinghai. This is Datong, which is a village that mainly grows wheat. And hygiene there looks different from that dry plateau area, right? It's a village life. People have these outdoor courtyards. Their housing is all around a courtyard. When you hold your baby out, you might sit on that little ledge there by the garden, hold the baby between your knees, might do its number ones on that concrete there, and it just dries up in the sun. It's not a big deal. Number twos, people would get ash from the fire, throw it on the number two, and then sweep it up and chuck it out down the long drop or wherever else was appropriate for that to go, sometimes out in the fields. So hygiene situated in place looks different there. Here, and this is a marketplace near where I lived, a wet market. A lot of people lived in the little shops here or above the shops. Some of the people had rented shop rooms. They didn't have their own, sometimes they would have a sink, but they wouldn't have their own toilet. And so every time your baby needs to go toilet, you're not going to run over to the public toilets and wait in the line and pay your, 5 mile and then take your baby toilet. So people also held them out in public, sometimes on the concrete, sometimes in basins, sometimes on newspaper, and then wrapped up that newspaper and put it in the rubbish. So there was another way that hygiene was carried out here. In the courtyard next to our apartments, this is my daughter who's now 18 at university. We practiced outside, and people would, like this elderly Hui woman would hold their hold their grandchildren between their knees and let them do their number ones out here. Didn't see anyone do any number twos out there the whole time I was there, so I found out later why that was. So that's the situated in place. It's also situated between places. I had a baby, was practicing this with my baby, and if you've ever been on an aeroplane, which I'm sure you have, you know that it's very loud and the toilets are very loud. So we used to put this little potty here between our knees and hold the baby on the plane if we couldn't convince her to go on a nappy because she wasn't used to it. And this little top, they call it a top hat potty, fits between your knees. And she's wearing split crotch pants there as well. So that was the first trip when she was 4 months. And then it looks different again. This is in Christchurch. This is my garden where when this child and my other son toilet trained, they spent a lot of time with no pants on in the summer, but in the winter, sitting on potties like this. So the book is called A Post-Development Politics of Hygiene. And what I mean by that is what I mean by post-development is a way of thinking and writing about the world that doesn't accept development as being a single linear path that the whole world follows until we all look like the West. So why I'm telling you all these different places and how hygiene's practiced in Banyao and elimination communication or infant toileting is practiced different in all these places is to show that there isn't a linear progression from like these backward ideas of hygiene to modern hygiene. So post-development as a theoretical approach is about refusing that linearity, about intentionally disentangling change from singular paths and thinking of the world more like this garden. There's some structures which it gathers around, where the things grow, but there's multiplicity and diversity in that growth and change. There's not a necessary path, as you all know if you've tried to plant a garden. It doesn't always turn out how you expect it to. So the book begins with really thinking about multiplicity. What does multiplicity mean? And I've drawn on the work of Doreen Massey, who's a great thinker in this area. And she says this about space. If space is a simultaneity of stories so far, then places are collections of these stories, articulations within the wider power geometries of space. And their character is a product of these intersections within that wider setting and of what is made of them. And two, of the non-meetings up, the disconnections and the relations not established and the exclusions. And all this contributes to the specificity of place. So I really wanted to approach hygiene in a way that honoured that specificity of place and didn't try and line them up into what Doreen Massey also calls the historical queue, where we imagine that everyone's lined up in some way to the most modern. So I was also interested in thinking about the ways in which these places are not, it's not like all of these places are separate and they don't interconnect. They still interconnect and they co-produce each other in non-linear ways, which includes processes like colonialism and westernization and homogenization, but not necessarily. So Liu Xin is a Chinese anthropologist, and he talks about how the world of China is not only the Chinese world, so it's not just China by itself, but it's a symptomatic moment of our world at the present time. And he also talks about how it goes the other way, that China has influenced the world in many different ways as well. So yeah, I think I've made my point there. I don't want to line things up. But then I was left with this. And this is an actual page I just photocopied from my PhD files I was looking at, and I was trying to work out, like, how do all these things relate to each other? Like, if it's not linear, but you still want to trace back those historical trajectories that Doreen Massey talks about, you know, to get to the simultaneity of space, but thinking about those trajectories, how do I trace those out? And so structuring the book was really hard to think about. And I ended up sort of structuring it around a kind of small assemblage and then a larger assemblage and then a small assemblage and then a larger assemblage. So that's the sort of structure of the book to try and help me, you know, make a linear book out of a very multiple thing. So I was interested in thinking here about how hygienes change. How do we think about the practicalities of space, but also the different ontologies and worldviews that shaped those urban spaces that these practices are part of. And so here I've tried to simplify it in a way that's not a big mess for you. And I started to think about how the spatiality of these different hygiene practices worked in these different cities. So this is a photo from the courtyard where I lived. And there's a small toddler here. She's wearing split crotch pants. She's sitting on her grandmother's foot. And the grandmother is sitting on a folding stool, and they're outdoors. Don't have anything else with them. They've just come down. There's about 300 apartments in this courtyard. Come down to play outside. And the only thing touching the ground is their feet. Yeah. And every time a baby sort of fell over or tried to crawl, people would come over, put it back on its feet, just gently correct it back onto its feet. You're not touching the ground. Take your hands away from the ground, wipe them off. So there was this sense of separating spaces for hygiene. Yes, babies can pee on the ground, but no, babies cannot crawl on the ground. And a lot of babies never crawl. They went straight to walking, which really messes up all of our child development you know, assumptions that we have in the West. And it was really about prioritizing the skin health of the baby. So when I interviewed people about how the practice worked, they felt like nappies would be like enclosing that bottom space in something wet and damp and hot. And, you know, in Chinese medicine, that would create all these other problems, like their blood wouldn't circulate well, they'd get cradle cap, they'd get colic, they would wake in the night, and they were just like, that's not worth it at this time when I was doing my field work. And the third thing they said is that it's no trouble at all. So you just hold the baby out, it goes. If it gets wet, just change its pants, wash them out. It's really not a big deal. So people didn't see it as being this massive, intensive mothering thing, which is how I see it critiqued when it's practiced in the West. Here's a photo from Melbourne. And so here I did a field work, a focus group, and these mums are sitting on the ground. You can see they've got a lot of stuff. They've got bags, they've got slings, they've got nappies, they've got drink bottles, bits of paper. That's my participant information sheet. There's a lot of stuff. They're on the ground. Everyone's touching the ground. But what do you do with your waste? This little baby in front needed to go for a pee. Mum got out a folding potty, put a plastic bag in it, and sat the baby on the potty, and then wrapped up that plastic bag and put it in the bin. And I was thinking, that's just like a disposable nappy. And I was thinking, why is this? It's because culturally, in this space, it's about preventing contamination. You know, you're protecting the environment from the waste of these babies rather than the other way around. And secondly, when I interviewed people about why they were practicing, it was about environmental health. They wanted to save nappies. They wanted to move up the waste hierarchy. They wanted to avoid waste. And for some people, it was also about infant attachment and getting to know your baby and its signals as part of their, and some babies just kind of demanded it, were just very demanding about not wanting to be in wet nappies. The third thing was that people framed it as hard work that might pay off. Some people framed it as it definitely paid off, but other people on the forum started to question themselves. My baby didn't toilet train any earlier than a normal one. Why did I waste all this time doing that? People said things like that, while others, you know, felt like they did save a lot of time. So I've kind of put it in a binary here. It's not really a binary, but just a way of sort of helping you understand how these different practices work in different urban environments. I was going to spend some time tracing back the historical assemblage in Sheening, but I realized that I'm not going to have time to do that. So I'm just going to skip over a few slides. But originally I was going to talk a little bit about the history of hygiene in China and the way of thinking about hygiene in traditional Chinese medicine. So the Chinese word for hygiene is wei sheng, which literally could be translated as guarding life or to guard life. There's lots of different, you know, takes on that, but that is the sort of quite literal meaning of those characters. So there's ancient uses of that word before it meant hygiene, and it meant sort of the path of guarding life. So I'll kind of skip through this here, but the basic point is that it was about knowing the right time and place to do things, for example, with reference to the season and with reference to the environment around you, and about ingesting medicinal food. So that term really came from the sense of health and well-being that was about relating to the environment. And there were some other things about that which I haven't talked about in the book, about what guarding life might be. But when it came to sort of contemporary times, and we're talking here from sort of 1900s, this understanding of guarding life kind of came into contact with biomedical understandings of hygiene. Excuse me. This image is of some hygiene workers during the Manchurian plague in 1910, which had 100% fatality rate. And so China was really pressured internationally to get this plague under control, or they would be invaded by Japan or Russia to control it. 100% fatality rate. So they got this Malaysian doctor in, Dr. Wu Lien Tay, and he had a microscope, and he worked out that the plague was transferred by this bacillus. Everyone that died had this bacillus. Everyone that didn't die didn't have the bacillus, and basically proved germ theory for the first time. And so that really strengthened Western biomedicine under the Republican government in China. But the Communist Party supported traditional Chinese medicine, which was very fragmented and didn't sort of have a national body until it sort of had to form one in response to the growing popularity of Western biomedicine. So yeah, there's a lot there that I'm not going to go into. I also traced out the sort of shadow hygienes, which were people who were more like this guy here, Nia Yuntai, who was interested in reclaiming traditional Chinese hygiene as a relational approach rather than a separatist approach. And he emphasized that in traditional Chinese medicine, when you like served yourself first from the plate so you didn't get tuberculosis, you were actually damaging your own psyche. And so it wasn't healthy to enact these Western, well, not Western, but biomedical forms of hygiene. And then we also have a system in China where multiple medical systems are supported by the state. So we have a situation where there's a kind of inbuilt multiplicity already, where people understand there's these different medical systems. They don't quite overlap, and they're not quite complementary, but there's a practice of thinking in a pluriversal way, of acknowledging that there's these other ways of doing things, definitely on the ground of people I was talking to. So those are kind of 4 of the trajectories that come together into Sheening, into the time where I was interviewing people. There's traces of each of these in the ethnography and in the interviews that I can see. So what I kind of learned from that process of tracing those hygiene assemblages is that it is possible to think multiplicity and also think how change works. And the stories that I gathered showed us that hygiene is an assemblage. Place, of course, as I started with, is a simultaneity of these historical trajectories. And change happens through this kind of shifting and reassembling in between places and realities, with the state, with kind of chance, like with that plague, you know, with different collectivizations of different bodies. So that was sort of how I was thinking about what I learned about change from studying that historical trajectory. But how does intentional change happen? How do we do that reworking of ourselves into different forms of hygiene? Do we just have to wait for some historical trajectory to come and grab us? Or is there something that we can sort of do? So in the second part of the book, I developed thinking around the reworking of ourselves, particularly in the West. So looking at these OzNappy-free families, particularly mothers, and what they were doing in reworking their own embodied hygienes and sharing in that work together with researching and experimenting with themselves and their babies. And I drew on understandings of hybrid collectives from Michel Calon, researching in the wild. So thinking about these collectives of mothers on OzNappy-free as researchers with a research project. And, you know, Calon worked with the French Muscular Dystrophy Association, and he looked at how we could actually consider these patients as researchers who are cooperating with professional scientists. And he calls that, with Rabi Harisoa, a new form of research, which they call research in the wild. And they talk about the hybrid collective being the hybridity of people, of lay and professional, but also the hybridity of technology and the non-human as part of that hybrid collective. So I was thinking, well, if any of your parents, we all know parenting's pretty experimental. We don't know what we're doing a lot of the time. This is a photo of my daughter crying in the field that illustrates me not knowing what I'm doing sometimes. Working out these sort of experiments. This is a weird potty I got from the $2 shop to try and work out how I was going to do this. You know, so it's often experimental, but it's often individualized. We're all working it out again, over and over, sometimes with the help of friends and family, but not always. So a lot of feminist critiques of, you know, these sort of intensive mothering practices are about how it's individualizing labor, caring labor. But I didn't feel like that really fit with how people thought of themselves in this OzNappy-free forum. And here is one quote from a participant who says, perhaps people are starting to see the madness of our disposable nappy-driven 4-year-olds in nappy society, and we're the beginning of a move back towards early toilet training as the norm. So they understood themselves as doing something more than just managing their own children. And the images I've got there is kind of the transition from the mad scientist in the lab doing research, you know, to a mum and a baby in front of a computer who are somehow participating in doing research. So I'm almost done here, but what is the research question that they were trying to answer? And I think it was framed in many different ways, but the overall question of the forum was, how do we adopt this practice that they called elimination communication to a vastly different environment and culture? How do we do that? And when they tried to answer that question, they formed a collective. It wasn't just individuals on their own. There was mothers usually. I think 98% of the posts were from mothers. And sometimes some of the ones from fathers were like mother typing, father talking. So mothers and email, but also these other people around the mothers, caregivers, also the babies speaking into that, computers obviously mediating that, tablets, phones, internet infrastructure, Wi-Fi providers, cameras, it goes on. This is like a Latorian list of all of the things in the assemblage, you know, Yahoo forums, Yahoo, and also the microbes that, you know, were shifted around in these processes, and the hormones, so the hygienes that were produced. So that's one mother there with the email, and you multiply that tons of times, that's your hybrid collective, a messy hybrid collective of people connecting via technology. So what was their research agenda? These were the themes that I found them to be researching the most in 2009. So sustainable consumption, how do we consume sustainably, including water, balancing care, balancing self-care, in this case with caring for an infant attachment and experience. And then that last one, sharing knowledge. How do we talk about what we do and how do we share it with other people so it's kind of not so weird and it becomes possible in the spaces that people are in? So there was a lot about, oh, I took my kid for a wee behind a bush and someone asked me what I was doing and then I had to explain it. So there's a few things like that, but also how do we collectivize this knowledge in an archive so people can join the group and find those archive knowledges as well. So back to my question, how does hygiene change happen? How do we rework ourselves into different forms of hygiene? First answer from the trajectories, hygiene is an assemblage, change happens through shifting and reassembling, but also hybrid collectives, researching in the wild, individually and collectively, and multiplying the possibilities and increasing the capacity to act. So when this research fieldwork was done early in, mainly in 2006, 2009 and 2012, this was a very fringe practice. But now I see people talking about it a lot more. People who are saying their child's kindy is supporting them in doing that. And so some of this has shifted, some of it hasn't shifted, but there's a sense that this hybrid collective doing research in the wild is how some of this change happens. Last slide, what does it mean for urban informality? Just kind of making it up here, but I think it means that change involves reworking ourselves and our environments. Change is already happening and we know more than we think. And I think often, especially students, you know, can feel really disempowered by, you know, in New Zealand, we have a very annoying government at the moment and it feels very disempowering, but there's a lot happening. There's more happening than we often notice. And then lastly, collectivizing bottom-up change is as important as top-down policy and infrastructure. And that collectivization can happen in really informal, technology-mediated ways. So yeah, kia ora koutou, thank you for having me. Oh, and that's, I don't know if that code works anymore, but it's worth a try.
Thanks, Kelly. I mean, such a powerful, creative and provocative intervention, I would say. I mean, you started with following the nappy and then all those different things like then waste, body, hygiene, garden, all those different sort of like spaces and practices started to unfold. So, I mean, with my geographer hat, I can definitely relate to Bruno Latour and others and that who talked about, I mean, should we go back to that non-modern life and recognize all those assemblages? But also with my architect's hat, what I can see here, there are a lot going on, those informal, I mean, very sort of like sensorial practices and how those are kind of shaping particular spaces, so producing particular kind of spaces that are built on also social relations. So in some way, how those private, motherly, domestic care is also coming out of those private domains to semi-public spaces. So there is a lot to take from these. So I must stop and open for questions from here who are in person, but please, who you have joined online, either share your question via chat box, or if you want to ask questions, please, put your hands up. Crystal.
Yeah, sure. So happy to start. Kelly, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So thoughtful, and you certainly raised a whole series of issues or ways of thinking that I hadn't really considered myself. But there was a couple of things that came up for me as I was listening to the presentation. And I'm wondering how if you're engaging with this in your work, but situating it within the context of place was wonderful. But I was also thinking about place and structure, right? And so thinking about patriarchy, thinking about class and privilege, and how your work was interacting with that. Because I couldn't help but feel at times, oh, the patriarchy, intensive mother, like it's a different kind of mothering, but there were no, I didn't see men, right? And so it's just, and then thinking about class, like who is doing this work and how that plays out in terms of how do we understand our commitment to reducing waste and who's doing that work. So these are just broad questions, just curious to know your reflections and insights.
Yeah, great question. And I feel like it's sort of overwhelming to think about the patriarchy. But I think one of my ways of engaging with it is to highlight and bring into scholarly awareness the importance of women's everyday lives. And so, yeah, I don't think it answers the question of how to overthrow the patriarchy, but it does bring into scholarship the everyday lives, the things that people were caring about and trying to do in the world, and kind of honoring that and not dismissing it as, oh, here's another example of women, in motherhood role, blah, blah, blah. And so I kind of feel that myself, but I also was trying to bring this ethic of, like interpreting, like a feminist ethic of interpreting with people rather than on to them, right? And so I have written in another paper on learning to be affected about men learning to be affected by babies' signals, and how that's a corollary to breastfeeding. So breastfeeding, of course, is very gendered, and often fathers feel, well, you know how to do the thing, I can't really participate. And there's a bit of maternal gatekeeping around, well, no, that's not how you put the nappy on, you should do it like this. And so I was interested in the way that this practice of infant toileting was potentially non-gendered, and other family members could learn to read babies' signals in a way that mimics or is maternal intuition, could develop intuition through these practices. So in a paper in Emotion, Space and Society, I talk a bit more about that and its potential to do that. I haven't really dealt with class, and I think, that's a huge question. I think it was difficult to know people's class because it was an online forum and it's very anonymous. But I imagine just from how people talked about things and the fact that writing was the main form of communication, that people had a high level of education, which probably indicates middle class. And then probably some of those people were stay-at-home parents who were quite like active and, in researching and putting everything into stay-at-home parenting as their sort of career choice, which also indicates middle class. Yeah. But in saying that, I think, I often liken it to veganism. People who are vegan are very passionate about it, but the fact that they're passionate about it and kind of won't give in to drinking dairy means all of us can access non-dairy milks at the cafe whenever we want. So I don't want to dismiss them as, just middle-class women and it's not possible for others, because it might become more possible. And certainly in China, it's the opposite. It's poorer people practicing, not wealthier people, or wealthier people had more problems with it because they were trying to uphold different forms of hygienic modernity that were kind of imposed from other places or developing themselves. And I'm in the far west of China, so not in the eastern seaboard, which has quite a different kind of take on this.
I can ask a follow-up question. Go ahead. Very, very quick. Broadening the discussion out into sort of into hygiene more generally, did you find any sort of gender components to it? Because when I was thinking about hygiene, I was also thinking about women's menstruation and how that's been framed in the past.
Yeah.
security and
yeah, there actually was a kind of side discussion that like another whole forum developed, that they had to start a forum because people keep getting distracted. There was at the time, it was when menstrual cups were coming out, and people were working out how to use them, like very detailed, like I find that if I do it in this particular way, you know, so a lot of detailed information. Yeah, so that was definitely in there too. Yeah.
Yes, so I had a question about kind of something you mentioned as an aside, but about the political economy of the manufacturing and marketing of these new products, because in many of the Asian societies, they came in probably, not in my generation, certainly, we didn't have any of this.
I was raised in that way.
Exactly, so was I. So, you know, it's probably say like my nieces, that generation who are beginning to use it, but still it's still very expensive to use it. I know this because my mom has dementia, and we have now introduced her in the last year to wearing these, and we are all so averse to it.
Yeah.
Because it's such an alien thing, but the carer that we have for her just won't deal with anything else. Yeah. So just the idea of what do we do with it? How do we dispose of it? Because we don't have systems in place. This is in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
But the question I wanted to ask you was really the comment you made about milk food. So I remember that whole sort of, I remember this this famous essay that was written by some, or speech that was given by someone on milk and murder about the milk powder companies in 1939, which set up this whole kind of, you know, change in the understanding of nutrition. And it also reminded me when I first came to Australia, I saw a publication by one of the Canadian wheat companies that was buying wheat from Australia about how to open up the Indian market. And this article basically said the problem with the Indian market is that people come to the shop with bags and bottles, and they expect to fill the bottle with oil and fill the bag with rice. And packaging is not working. So how do we get them sold on packaging? So that they'll not bring this, and the whole discussion was about that. So my interest is, to what extent are the marketing practices aligning themselves with the notion of changing the culture? That's how these companies go into Asia. They really think through, how do we change them? What do we do?
The way of life.
I mean, I don't feel like I have the definitive answer to that, except to agree with you. And I think, I mean, that is what marketing is changing culture, right? Like that's what they're trying to do. I'm currently working with an ethical marketing company to do a campaign about geography, actually, Ash, through the New Zealand Geographical Society. And so they have a very like strong thing. We're not going to market anything that we think is damaging to the environment or to justice. But there's very few out there like that, you know, and this with the Procter & Gamble study, the reason the study was undertaken was that Procter & Gamble partnered with a university and tried to find out why people weren't buying the nappies. And so they're the ones that found out people were only using one a day. And then they partnered with social scientists, and they found out, well, Chinese families really care about whether their kids are smart. So how can we make nappies link with smartness? Because that's how the formula companies advertise, right? If your child drinks this, it's got these particular things in it, which breast milk also has, but they don't mention that will make them smarter. And so what they did was they did a study, and they found that babies that wore disposable nappies slept 30 minutes longer per night than babies that did not wear nappies, because they woke in the night and the parents would hold them out. And then they linked sleep to intelligence. And then they told everyone, if your baby wears disposable nappies, they will get more sleep and they will be smarter. And I was just like, oh my God, the world is in dire straits if these are people who use all of their energy and smartness to come up with these ridiculous marketing things. I think, you know, put your powers to good. Don't join the evil side. So yeah, I don't really have an answer to that, but it's definitely a huge problem. And I've read articles about how to break open the Indian market to disposable nappies, and what can we learn from China. And they did change the product to make it softer, to make it less absorbent, because people wanted to change them more often and not leave the baby in it. So they made them less absorbent. They made them with little sticky things so you could pop them in and out of a split crotch pants and then still take it off, hold the baby up, put it back on without having to lie them down and all the palaver that you would have to do without change tables. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Kelly, we have a few questions online. So, okay. and a comment from Catherine. So the first question is from Anitra Nelson. How do these infant waste-free or lowest practice compare with adult toileting in those other spaces?
Yeah, so adults didn't do that. So it was really a recognition that a baby can't hold on or can't be, you know, so can't, you know, plan to go to the toilet in the same way. So in those spaces where people were living without toilets, they, in the market, they used public toilets and paid to go into those sometimes. And there was adult potties that people would keep, and if they had a room and they had a shared bathroom situation or they had to go to public toilets at night, they often had a potty with a lid that was an adult potty, kind of like, you know, what you'd have in a caravan, chemical toilet type thing, but simpler. And then in rural areas, it was mainly what I would call long drop toilets, which are pit latrines. And so that was often quite dangerous for children to go into because it was balancing on planks over cesspits. So yeah, children were supported to toilet in these places, but not adults. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Kelly. So the other question, I mean, Catherine had a comment on relating to menstruation. So yeah, what she's mentioning, so there is this company in India recycling menstruation pads. I wonder if they could use the technology for adult and children diapers.
Yeah, well, there is a bit of research on that, on just general composting materials. And what most of the researchers found is that you need so much compost in order to compost it down. And also the materials don't really, like maybe menstruation pads do, but most materials don't really add anything to the compost. So you need to have huge volumes of compost in order to break them down. So it's not really viable as a permanent full strategy when we know that 50% of landfill in domestic landfill is disposable nappies. So the amount of compost you need to do that, and the fact that it doesn't add anything nutritious to the compost, means that it's not. But I'll check that out and see. They might be doing it in a different way. That would be interesting.
So, Kathy, Kelly, we are running out of time.
That's all right. I know Swanima. I can catch up with you.
Very powerful comment from Sharnima. So in her experience, I have often seen academia aspires macro changes and action research is driven by micro changes. So how do we mediate between the two?
Yeah, it's interesting, eh? And because I feel like academics focusing on macro changes is a response to the sort of individualization of neoliberalism. So you're wanting to push back against that and say it's not up to individuals to change their practices, it's up to society to make it possible and easy for them to change their practices. So I think that's why academics try to go macro, but we're also pushed in our impact factors, right? Like what policy has you influenced through your work to do that as well. And then action research, it's not necessarily micro changes. I think it's ground up changes, and they can be linked together in ways that make them more meaningful than just a single example, in really important place situated ways, right? That rather than rolling out the hand washing program, you go into place and do an action research. What's the problem here? Oh, the problem is worms. People have worms. How do we stop the problem of worms, rather than just assuming hand washing is necessarily the answer.
And exactly, Kelly. I mean, that's really a wonderful way to end our session, because often when we talk about development in informal settlements, we often take that macro perspective of big sanitation projects in informal settlements.
Yeah.
But how about harnessing some of these micro practices and then putting them ground up, and what kind of a spatiality we might think about, right? So with this spirit, we want to end here. So thanks for joining everybody here and in person, online. Just a final note. I mean, we have a LinkedIn page, which is the Informal Urbanism Research Hub now, through which we'll post all the wonderful updates, and we'll also share this recording in a few days' time as well. So please, link us through that LinkedIn page, and
cool.
Stay connected.
Thank you. Thanks, Ash, for inviting me, and great to see you all. Yeah. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye, everybody.